Hey guys, tonight we begin. What if I told you the Romans had a solution for information overload centuries before smartphones? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Step into a Roman library, and the first thing you'd notice is what you didn't hear. No carts rumbling outside, no market vendors shouting, just the occasional rustle of papyrus or the squeak of a stylus on wax. This wasn't an accident. In a city notorious for its noise, think chariots clattering on stone streets, public baths roaring with gossip. These spaces were designed as sanctuaries from sensory overload. The Romans didn't invent libraries, but they were the first to treat silence as a design feature rather than an afterthought. The typical layout worked like an acoustic trap. Thick walls of opus cementicium, that's Roman concrete to you, absorbed sound better than marble. Colonnades created sound buffers between reading areas. Some libraries even used terracotta pipes in the walls, ancient baffling to deaden echoes. The floors, often layered with sand or crushed pottery beneath mosaics, creating a surface that muffled footsteps. Compare that to today's coffee shop study areas with their clanking espresso machines, and you start wondering if we've actually progressed. Silence enforcement fell to slave librarians called a bibliotheca. These weren't just shelf stackers. They were the library bouncers. Armed with rods and the authority to eject offenders, they patrolled like librarians crossed with nightclub security. Record-keeping was serious business too. Chroniclers mention fines for everything from loud whispering to dropping scrolls. The worst offenders got banned completely. Imagine getting blacklisted from Alexandria's collection because your sandals squeaked. The psychology behind this was surprisingly modern. Romans understood that environment shapes behavior long before neuroscience confirmed it. Library rules forced patrons into what we'd now call deep work mode. No wandering between shelves. You requested scrolls in advance. No eating or drinking near the collection. Even coughing too loudly could get you side-eyed by both staff and other readers. What emerged was an early version of the social contract we recognize in libraries today. Shared space means shared sacrifice of petty freedoms. Visitors adjusted quickly, though. Accounts describe scholars spending 10 to 12-hour days in these rooms, their oil lamps burning into the night. The lack of distractions bred a kind of hyper-focus we struggle to replicate today. No checking messages, no quick social media breaks, just you, your thoughts, and maybe a grumpy enslaved librarian judging your posture. Modern studies on flow states suggest the Romans were onto something. Their libraries were productivity machines disguised as buildings. This system had cracks, of course. Enforcement depended on the librarian's mood. Wealthy patrons sometimes flouted rules without consequence, and the silence wasn't egalitarian. Enslaved copyists worked in noisier annexes, their scratching pens creating the very scrolls enjoyed in quiet luxury elsewhere. But the core idea held. Focused time required designed space. Notice how modern libraries still follow this blueprint. The quiet floors, the no-phones zones, the death glares from circulation desks. It's all there. We've just swapped papyrus for paperbacks and enslaved enforcers for undergrad work studies. The Roman innovation wasn't the book collection. It was the realization that knowledge needs protection from daily chaos. Scroll storage followed equally calculated logic. Papyrus hates humidity, so libraries were often uphill from water sources. Collections faced north to avoid sun damage. Even the wooden pigeonhole shelves, luckily, spaced scrolls to prevent rubbing. Every detail served the same goal: create conditions where focus wasn't effortful, but inevitable. The unintended side effect? These spaces became socially sterile. Unlike Greek libraries where debate flourished, Roman halls discouraged interaction. Some scholars lamented this. Creativity needs friction, after all. But for disciplined research, the model worked. Scrolls stayed pristine. Arguments happened elsewhere. Minds stayed trained on texts. Interestingly, the Roman approach contrasts with modern open-plan offices masquerading as collaborative spaces. We've spent decades tearing down walls in the name of creativity, only to rediscover what the Romans knew. Some work demands enclosure, not just physical, but sensory. Their solution wasn't headphones or focus apps. It was architecture that shaped behavior through constraint. We shouldn't romanticize it. The silence was enforced through brutal social hierarchies. The same system that protected scholars also barred most people from entering. But strip away the context, and there's a lesson. Distraction isn't new, and neither is the fight against it. The next time you struggle to concentrate, remember, 2 millennia ago, someone was dealing with the same problem. They just had better real estate solutions. The real genius lay in making concentration passive. Modern life asks us to will ourselves into focus against a tide of pings and notifications. Roman libraries reversed this. They made distraction the thing that required effort. Try whispering in a room designed to amplify every sound. Attempt to fidget when movement draws scowls. Sooner or later, you either left or started working. This architectural psychology extended beyond books. Many libraries had exedrae, curved niches that created natural auditory dead zones for private study. Others used water features near entrances to mask street noise. Even the scroll retrieval system minimized disruption. Slaves fetched materials so scholars wouldn't wander and chat. Compare this to today's brightly lit, activity-encouraging bookstores posing as libraries, and you see the divergence. What remains striking is how little these spaces catered to comfort. No plush chairs, no mood lighting, just stone benches and the implicit threat of shame if you started snoring. Yet people stayed for hours, days, even entire seasons. Maybe discomfort was the point. It discouraged lounging and reinforced purpose. Or perhaps when options are scarce, the mind adapts faster. The echoes of this system linger in unexpected places. University carols, archival reading rooms, even some coding boot camp setups mimic Roman principles. We've just outsourced discipline from architecture to willpower with mixed results. There's something humbling about realizing our push for productivity tech might be solving problems that brick and mortar already cracked centuries ago. Next time you're stuck trying to focus in a noisy world, consider this Roman trick. Physical barriers matter. They built walls against distraction. We try to wish it away with apps. Maybe quiet rooms didn't disappear. We just stopped knowing how to build them. Roman builders didn't just place walls where they looked good. They positioned them where they'd sound good. Walk into a library like the one in the Porticus Octaviae, and you'd feel the hush before you saw the scrolls. The ceilings arched just high enough to prevent echoes, but low enough to avoid that cavernous feeling. Floors sloped slightly toward the center, channeling any dropped stylus or sandal scrape away from readers. Even the door hinges were oiled with vegetable fat weekly to eliminate squeaks. Modern concert halls spend millions on acoustic engineering, but Romans nailed it with geometry and goat grease. They chose materials like tough stone for walls, not for looks, but because its porous texture swallowed sound. Cedar shelves absorbed humidity that warped papyrus, but also dampened vibrations when scrolls were slid in and out. Some libraries mixed horsehair into plaster for extra soundproofing, a trick later stolen by Renaissance music rooms. The effect was eerie. Stand in the center of Rome's Palatine Library, and you could hear a moth land on a parchment. Try that in your local Barnes Noble. Lighting was another silent weapon. Skylights faced north, avoiding direct sunlight that would make readers squint or overheat. Bronze mirrors polished to surgical precision bounced light onto reading tables without the flicker and smoke of oil lamps. This wasn't just about ambiance. Sputtering wicks demanded constant adjustment, each movement a potential distraction. Roman scholars got glare-free, shadowless light for 10 hours a day. Instagram influencers would riot for that kind of natural diffusion now. The layout played spatial psychology. Scroll niches alternated with solid walls in a zigzag pattern, breaking sight lines that might tempt daydreaming. Reading benches were spaced exactly 5 paces apart, close enough to share an ink pot, far enough to prevent accidental elbow bumps. You'd enter through a winding corridor lined with water clocks and sundials, subtly pressuring you to value time before reaching the books. Even the air mattered. Libraries were often uphill from gardens, so breezes carried floral scents, not sewage smells from the streets below. Location was everything. The Library of Hadrian sat between the Forum's political circus and the Campus Martius military grounds, but you'd never know it inside. Builders sunk the foundation 6 feet below street level, creating an acoustic moat against chariot noise. Outer walls were 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 1 foot near the roof as if shrugging off distant shouts from the baths. Compare this to Starbucks positioning their quiet study areas next to espresso grinders. Roman architects hated right angles almost as much as noise. Curved walls scattered sound waves that straight surfaces would bounce back. The library at Ephesus used convex alcoves that caught whispers and smothered them, ideal for tutors giving discreet lessons. Even the columns were strategic. Hollow ones stuffed with sand absorbed low-frequency rumbles from nearby construction. Modern sound engineers call this mass-loaded barriers. Romans called it not wanting to hear the neighbor's renovation. Temperature control doubled as noise control. Underground channels called hypocausts circulated warm air without the racket of swinging braziers. Summer libraries piped in cool air from mountain-facing tunnels, eliminating the need for flapping handheld fans. Winter spaces used double-glazed windows, thin sheets of mica sandwiched with animal bladder membrane. You'd get insulation without the sound leaks of shutters banging in wind. Your apartment's rattling AC unit should feel ashamed. Shelving systems optimized silence. Scrolls were stored in wooden cabinets with wool-lined drawers that slid out like silent butlers. Each cubby had a lead weight at the back, so closing it required no slamming. Librarians greased cabinet tracks with beeswax monthly. The only metal parts were the labels, small bronze tags hung on silk cords that didn't clink together. Modern archives still can't replicate this level of quiet storage without foam padding everywhere. The wealthy took it further. Private villa libraries often featured echo gardens, outer walls lined with ceramic jars that vibrated at frequencies matching human speech, canceling out conversations beyond them. One senator bragged his reading room was quieter than a tomb. He wasn't joking. Excavations show some elite libraries shared walls with family mausoleums, leveraging those structures' thick, soundproof construction. Even in death, the rich got better acoustics. Public libraries used water features as white noise machines. The Ulpian Library had a shallow channel running through its courtyard, the trickle masking street sounds without being loud enough to distract. Others positioned fountains at entrance arches, so visitors crossed a sonic curtain when entering. The effect was like putting on noise-canceling headphones. One moment, you're in the chaos of Rome. The next, you're in a bubble of quiet, broken only by the occasional annoyed librarian shushing someone. Scholars' accounts describe the strangeness of adjusting to these spaces. Your own breathing sounded loud. Clearing your throat felt rude. The lack of ambient noise made some writers claim they could literally hear their thoughts for the first time. Imagine Twitter addicts today enduring that existential terror. These designs migrated east when Constantine moved the capital. Byzantine libraries copied the Roman acoustic tricks, but added one innovation: domed ceilings with precise parabolic curves that focused sound downward like invisible spotlights. A tutor could murmur from the center and be heard clearly at every desk without raising his voice. It was ancient surround sound, minus the subwoofer. Monastic scriptoriums of the Middle Ages inherited the principles, but botched the execution. Their vaulted ceilings amplified nuns chanting into distracting reverberations. Parchment shelves faced south for maximum light but also maximum glare. Only when Renaissance architects dug up Vitruvius' notes did they rediscover Roman acoustic science. The Laurentian Library in Florence basically photocopied the Palatine Library's blueprint in the 1500s. What's sobering is how much knowledge was lost. We know the Library of Pergamum had a whispering gallery so precise scholars could have private conversations across the room. But modern attempts to reconstruct it fall short. Cologne's Roman library ruins suggest they tuned wall thickness to block specific street frequencies, like some ancient Fourier transform. The technical manuals explaining this? Burned as heating fuel by medieval monks. Modern libraries borrow Roman ideas awkwardly. Study carrels face walls like Roman cubbies, but then management mounts a buzzing LED panel overhead. Sound-absorbing panels mimic cedar shelves, but picnickers yammering near them ruin the effect. We've kept the aesthetics of quiet spaces while ignoring their engineering. Ever notice how rare real silence is now? The Romans would find that pathetic. The ultimate proof of their design's effectiveness. Famous authors complained about too much focus. Pliny the Younger griped he'd emerge from libraries so immersed he'd walk into doorframes. Martial wrote poems about losing track of days in the silence until slaves came looking for him. Today we medicate kids for attention disorders while demolishing every environment that might naturally cultivate concentration. These buildings weren't passive containers, but cognitive tools. Every curve, material, and spatial ratio work together to lower the mental cost of focus. We think we're advanced with our focus apps and noise-canceling headphones, but all we've done is invent personal band-aids for a cultural wound the Romans had already stitched up architecturally. Then there were the librarians, who took silence from structural feature to sacred doctrine. The librarians of Rome didn't just organize scrolls. They policed silence like prison guards. Step out of line, and you'd face the wrath of men who controlled access to all recorded knowledge. Most were educated slaves or freedmen, handpicked for their literacy and intimidating presence. Imagine a scholar who could quote Homer while gripping a wooden rod for striking noisy offenders. Their authority came straight from the library's patron, often the emperor himself, making them some of the most powerful non-citizens in Rome. New visitors had to pass initiation rituals designed to humble them. You'd present yourself at dawn, hands inspected for dirt before handling scrolls. Wealthy patrons got away with snapping fingers for service, but anyone lower down the social ladder had to submit written requests on wax tablets. The librarian would nod or shake his head without speaking, pointing to approved study carrels. Some libraries required silent oaths sworn before household gods. One in Antioch made scholars wash their feet in herb-infused water, not for cleanliness, but to slow down restless shuffling. Disputes were settled with brutal efficiency. Two senators arguing over who saw a scroll first. The librarian would take it from both and assign copying duty. A student coughing too much? Banished to the portico for the day. The worst offenders, people caught stealing or damaging texts, got blacklisted in a ledger that all major libraries shared. Your name went in, and suddenly no scrolls were available anywhere in the empire. This system worked because librarians networked across cities, exchanging letters about problem patrons like modern bars, sharing photos of belligerent drunks. Their knowledge of the collections bordered on supernatural. No catalogs existed, just a head librarian who memorized every title, author, and shelf location. Some could pinpoint passages by smell, identifying water-damaged scrolls before unrolling them. Others tracked reader habits, noting which philosophers attracted the most plagiarists. The head librarian at Alexandria supposedly knew when someone lied about their research topic based on their scroll requests. The respect they commanded defied social hierarchies. Senators waited days for appointments with certain librarians. Emperors consulted them on archival matters. Martial wrote an entire epigram complaining about a librarian who made him wait while serving enslaved scholars first. This power imbalance frustrated the elite. A man who owned 5 villas still had to beg a freedman for permission to read Lucretius. Training was grueling. Apprentice librarians started by repairing scrolls, learning to patch tears with flax fibers and reed glue. After 5 years, they progressed to memorizing shelf locations. Only the best reached senior positions where they could enforce rules. One training manual survives. It recommends practicing silence by living alone in a cave for a month. Another suggests chewing bitter herbs to suppress coughs during long shifts. They developed tricks to maintain order without speech. A dropped stylus would get a pointed stare, not a scolding. Noisy sandals earned a librarian silently placing a wool mat at the offender's feet. Persistent whisperers found their scrolls mysteriously lacking the pages they needed. The message was clear. Break the silence, and the knowledge becomes fragmentary. Scroll security rivaled modern banks. Each morning, librarians counted texts against a master list scratched on bronze. At closing, they sealed cabinets with wax stamped by the emperor's ring. Night guards weren't just there to deter thieves. They prevented scholars from hiding inside to study after hours. One record from Pompeii details a student who tried this. The librarian had him copy remedial grammar scrolls for 6 months as punishment. Their salaries reflected this responsibility. While most slaves earned nothing, head librarians received payment in gold coins and property. Augustus's chief librarian, Gaius Julius Hyginus, bought his freedom within a decade through bonuses. Some even got tombs carved with their titles, unheard of for others in their social class. The trade-off? Complete devotion. Librarians couldn't marry or own businesses. Many signed lifetime contracts where any mistake meant demotion to manual labor. Women faced special restrictions. Female scholars needed male relatives to vouch for them in writing. Librarians assigned them curtained alcoves for modesty, which conveniently isolated their perceived distraction. A few elite women circumvented this by owning private libraries staffed with enslaved female librarians, the only context where women controlled access to texts. Most female readers settled for excerpts copied by male relatives, an early form of content filtering. Foreign scholars had it worse. Visiting Greeks were frisked for writing materials, accused of smuggling plans back to Athens. Jewish researchers needed military escorts to enter certain libraries, their notes reviewed upon exit. The librarian at the Temple of Apollo reportedly poured vinegar on papyrus, a Persian scholar touched, claiming purification. Xenophobia wasn't just tolerated, it was policy. Yet these gatekeepers enabled Rome's intellectual golden age. They preserved texts through civil wars and fires, memorizing whole works when scrolls disintegrated. Some secretly made extra copies of banned philosophy, hiding them behind officially approved histories. Their meticulous records let modern historians reconstruct lost lineages of thought. The paradox was their invisibility. Great libraries bore emperors' names, not librarians. Scrolls credited authors, not the men who saved them from decay. When libraries burned, the custodians died trying to salvage texts while patrons fled. Their legacy persists whenever a modern librarian shushes someone. That instinct to protect concentration spans 2 millennia. What's striking is how their methods still work. Studies show quiet spaces need human enforcers, not just signage. People obey rules whispered by an attendant faster than signs screaming silence. The Romans knew discipline flows from authority, not architecture alone. The last known Roman librarian, Quietest, worked as the Visigoths sacked the city in 410 AD. Records say he refused to leave his post, chaining himself to a shelf of Seneca's works. Whether heroic or pathological, his stubbornness captures the ethos. These men saw themselves as the thin parchment barrier between order and chaos. Today's librarians inherit their contradictions, expected to be both servile and authoritative, invisible but omnipresent. The job still attracts those who believe knowledge deserves guarding, even if the weapons are now late fine wavers instead of wooden rods. What they guarded, those scrolls, were even more temperamental than the scholars who read them. Delicate, expensive, and as prone to vanishing as thoughts unrecorded, holding knowledge in Rome was a fragile business. The scrolls in Roman libraries demanded more care than newborn babies. Made from Egyptian papyrus, each sheet cost a day's wages for skilled labor before anyone even wrote on it. The plant fibers ran horizontally on one side, vertically on the other. Great for durability, terrible when damp. A single spilled cup of wine could liquefy months of work. Wealthy libraries imported special saltwater-resistant papyrus from Alexandria, but even that turned brittle if stored near olive oil lamps. Copying texts was surgical work. Scribes used a feather-light touch with reed pens to avoid tearing fibers. The best ink was made from soot, oak gall, and iron salts. Cheaper versions ate through papyrus in decades. Errors weren't erased, but painted over with a milk and chalk mixture that yellowed faster than the original text. Some manuscripts show 6 layers of corrections, creating a palimpsest of mistakes. Surviving fragments reveal scribe struggles. Shaky lines where hands cramped, smudges from sweat droplets, even the occasional nasal imprint from falling asleep mid-copy. Storage methods bordered on obsessive. Scrolls got cedar oil rubs every 6 months to repel insects. Workers sealed shelves with time-infused beeswax to deter moths. Each scroll lived in a wool-lined parchment jacket labeled with a lead tag. Humidity-controlled rooms used clay pots of salt to absorb moisture. The same pots got checked weekly for condensation. One library in Carthage employed a full-time slave just to brush dust off scroll ends with a goose feather duster. Damage control was constant. Wormholes demanded immediate honey injections to halt tunneling. Torn edges required flax fiber stitches with starch-based glue. Sun-bleached texts got carefully re-inked by specialists who matched original pigments. The worst jobs went to the piss scribes, slaves who urinated on moldy sections to reactivate faded ink before copying. Their workplaces smelled exactly as bad as you'd imagine. Categorization systems looked random but followed strict logic. Scrolls weren't alphabetized, but grouped by topic clusters resembling modern hashtags. A tag reading, Juck or Cicero, or rhetoric. Consulship might sit beside Crassus. Land reform based on political connections. Color coding indicated provenance. Purple for Greek originals, ochre for Sicilian translations. Finding a specific work required interrogating librarians who'd memorize these networks. Lose one librarian, and you effectively lost whole sections of the collection. The rare book trade made modern collectors look tame. A first edition Virgil scroll could cost more than a country estate. Forgery flourished. Unscrupulous dealers aged new papyrus with vinegar fumes and glued on fake wormholes. Some spliced cheap commentaries onto authentic texts, selling them as annotated originals. Wealthy buyers hired verification experts who smelled scrolls for telltale cedar oil or held them up to check fiber patterns against known imperial shipments. Fire was the ultimate nightmare. The Library of Alexandria's famous burning overshadows hundreds of smaller disasters. A single toppled oil lamp could erase centuries of work. Elite libraries kept bronze buckets of sand and vinegar water mixtures every 10 feet. Night watches rotated in 2-hour shifts to stay alert. Some collections stored duplicates in separate buildings, but only the richest could afford this. After Nero's fire, Roman librarians developed an early form of microfilm, condensing key texts onto tiny scrolls that could be grabbed quickly. Pests were relentless. Bookworms, actual larvae, left winding tunnels through texts. Silverfish ate glue from bindings. In humid climates, entire collections fell victim to papyrus rot, a fungus that turned scrolls into foul-smelling mush. Pompeii's libraries show desperate measures. Arsenic powder sprinkled between shelves, cedar chips sewn into scroll jackets, even sacrificial offerings to Jupiter found neatly placed in infestation hotspots. Transporting scrolls was risky business. Merchants shipped them in lead-lined chests padded with lamb's wool. Military dispatches got priority over literature. Many philosophical works arrived waterlogged after waiting months on docks. One account describes a shipment from Athens stored next to salted fish. The scrolls absorbed brine and warped into unopenable spirals. Wealthy travelers carried personal libraries in camel caravans with temperature-controlled compartments, paying extra for guards who knew not to jostle the cases. Copying teams worked under brutal conditions. The Vatican's records mention scriptoriums where scribes' hands were tied to prevent wiping sweat on scrolls. Supervisors timed ink dipping to minimize blotches. A single sneeze could mean 10 days pay docked. The fastest copyists developed repetitive stress injuries described in medical texts as scriber's claw. Their compensation? Occasionally getting to add a tiny signature in the margin, the ancient equivalent of a Photoshop watermark. Scrolls also suffered from intentional harm. Conquerors burned enemy libraries to erase cultural memory. Religious fanatics scratched out heretical passages with iron styluses. Even scholars vandalized texts. Aristotle's lost dialogues survive only as fragmented quotes in works where rivals misrepresented his ideas. Librarians retaliated by embedding curses in colophons. May whoever steals this scroll vomit blood for 9 generations. The fragility shaped what survived. Lightweight poetry scrolls outlasted heavy legal codes simply because fewer people handled them. Marginalia-heavy texts often succumbed to ink acidity eating through papyrus. Ironically, some of the best preserved works come from trash heaps, where Egyptians recycled papyrus into mummy wrappings, the resin preservative accidentally saving fragments. Compared to modern books, scrolls were hopelessly inefficient. No page numbers, just rough location estimates based on rod measurements. Bookmarks were silk ribbons sewn into edges that often tore loose. Readers had to unroll with one hand while re-rolling with the other, a skill that took years to master without causing splits. Private tutors taught children scroll handling before alphabet lessons, like learning to drive before reading road signs. Yet these fragile objects built empires. Roman law spread via identical scrolls copied in centralized scriptoriums. Military campaigns carried standardized maps replicated by enslaved teams. Even religious changes hinged on scroll durability. Early Christian texts overtook pagan works, partly because parchment codices lasted longer than traditional papyrus. The economics made knowledge a luxury. Producing a single 30-foot scroll of Plato's Republic required 40 uninterrupted days of skilled labor. Private collectors often owned just 5 or 6 texts their entire lives. Public libraries displayed dummy scrolls, hollow rods with fancy caps, to impress visitors while keeping real treasures locked away. Conservation failures haunt historians. Pliny's lost volumes on Carthaginian agriculture, eaten by mice in a Spanish monastery. Sappho's complete poems, used as kindling by Byzantine monks. The original Aeneid draft, recycled into 8th century accounting ledgers. We know these works existed only because other scrolls complain about their disappearance. Modern preservation looks reckless by Roman standards. We store priceless manuscripts in buildings with sprinkler systems that would ruin them in minutes, or archival boxes off-gas acids that slowly poison contents. Even digitization projects use lights hot enough to damage pigments. The Romans at least knew their limitations. They never assumed texts would last forever, just long enough to copy again. Yet somehow, fragments endured. Workers in Herculaneum died clutching scrolls to their chests, the volcanic heat carbonizing but preserving them. Desert sands buried Coptic Christian texts in jars that stayed dry for 16 centuries. A single overloaded bookship sank off Sicily with its cargo of lead-protected scrolls now being recovered by robots. The librarian's battle against decay never really ended. It just changed arenas. Today's archivists fight bit rot and format obsolescence instead of silverfish. But the goal stays the same: outrace time with fragile vessels of thought. Access to these treasures was another matter entirely. Possessing knowledge was one thing. Controlling who could touch it was power distilled to its purest form. The quietest rooms in Rome were also the most exclusive. That hush you admired came at a price, and not just in denarius. Step up to a Roman library's bronze doors without the right credentials, and the slave at the entrance would cross his arms wordlessly. No shouting, no forceful removal, just the silent treatment that said more than any ejection notice. Patrons needed 3 things to enter: citizenship proof, a letter of recommendation, and clean hands. The first 2 filtered out the poor and unconnected. That last requirement? Mostly theater. Librarians used the hand inspection to assess social status. Calluses meant manual labor, ink stains suggested education, soft skin signaled wealth. Only the right combination got you past the vestibule. Soldiers stationed nearby handled the rare cases where someone argued their case too loudly. Operating hours mocked working-class schedules. Collections opened at dawn but closed by noon on market days, when most citizens were busy earning wages. Night access required special permissions even senators struggled to obtain. The rationale? Artificial light endangered scrolls, but really it kept out the rabble who couldn't afford daytime leisure. Some libraries posted guards to shoo away loiterers who just wanted to escape street noise. Women faced elaborate hurdles. Those who gained entry, mostly elite widows and imperial relatives, got sequestered in curtained alcoves. Male relatives had to vouch for their research needs in writing. One record from Ostia mentions a scholar's daughter who disguised herself as a boy to access medical texts. When caught, her family paid a fine equal to 5 years' wages. Afterwards, all female patrons underwent hand inspections, with a female slave present to prevent similar scams. Foreign scholars needed military escorts. Greek academics petitioned for months just to view Roman copies of their own culture's works. Visiting Egyptians underwent searches for stolen texts upon exiting. The library at Rhodes famously rejected a Jewish historian's application because his Latin accent might disturb readers. Only diplomats with signed treaties in hand stood a chance, and even then librarians shadowed their every move. The patronage system determined everything. New libraries opened with donor lists specifying who could enter. Wealthy benefactors got private reading rooms while their social inferiors squeezed into communal spaces. Pliny the Younger complained about patrons who donated small sums just to see their names carved above better tables than lifelong scholars. Some collections kept benefactor scrolls, fake documents displayed prominently that no one was allowed to actually read. Hierarchy persisted inside. Senators sat closest to heat sources in winter. Equites, Rome's business class, got second-tier seating. Ordinary citizens stood at rear lecterns if they entered at all. The worst spots went to enslaved scholars copying texts for their owners. Positioned near drafty entrances where their shivering wouldn't annoy elites. Even scroll distribution followed rank. VIPs received complete works, while others got fragments deemed suitable for their station. Bribes flowed quietly. A few extra coins could make lost scrolls suddenly reappear. Library attendants earned bonuses for steering wealthy patrons toward specific philosophers favored by the current regime. The worst offenders sold access to restricted texts, then reported the buyers for unauthorized reading when payments lapsed. One bureaucrat's memoirs brag about playing rival scholars against each other for premium study slots. Unauthorized entry brought creative punishments. Peasants caught sneaking in might be forced to recopy water-damaged scrolls without pay. Soldiers stationed at libraries used trespassers for sword practice, non-lethally, but with enough bruising to deter repeats. The most humiliating penalty? Getting chained to a public book cart outside the library for a week, tantalizingly close to knowledge you couldn't reach. Personal libraries offered slightly better access, if you counted wealthy homes as public spaces. Some aristocrats allowed controlled visits to show off collections, usually during festivals when their social obligations required generosity. The catch? Guests had to listen to the owner's poetry readings first. Marshall sniped about suffering through 3 hours of bad verse just to glimpse one authentic Cicero. Teachers occupied a gray area. Grammar schools could request scroll loans, but librarians sent damaged or outdated texts. One Pompeian schoolteacher's records show receiving a weather-beaten Virgil with half the Aeneid missing. Private tutors fared better by name-dropping their patrons, though they still faced restrictions. Historians note some tutors smuggled scrolls out under tunics, necessitating the notorious strip searches at library exits. The system's hypocrisy was obvious. Rome assimilated knowledge from conquered cultures but barred those peoples from accessing it. Elite women commissioned great works but couldn't study them freely. Enslaved scholars preserved texts their descendants would be forbidden to read. Even the architecture whispered exclusion. Raised thresholds kept out the infirm. Narrow corridors hindered the obese. Steep stairs filtered the elderly. Yet the restrictions worked too well. By limiting access, Romans accidentally preserved texts that might have been worn out through overuse. The exclusivity also increased scrolls' perceived value, encouraging better conservation. Some scholars argue modern open access policies lead to more knowledge deterioration than Roman gatekeeping ever did. The daily routines of those who gained entry revealed surprising rhythms. Dawn arrivals queued outside with wax tablets and portable inkwells, the ancient equivalent of bringing your own laptop. Morning hours focused on serious study before afternoon breaks for scheduled stretching and eye rest exercises. Scholars swapped scrolls at lunch under strict no-talking rules resembling monastic sign language. Military veterans received preferential treatment that angered civilians. A retired centurion could walk into most libraries without appointments, getting first pick of new acquisitions. Some abused this privilege by running underground lending services, renting captured Greek texts to wealthy merchants at exorbitant rates. Army surgeons enjoyed unique perks. Their approved access to medical scrolls sometimes extended to civilian doctors willing to pay kickbacks. Seasonal changes affected access too. Summer saw libraries packed with students preparing for fall debates. Winter's shorter days meant increased competition for positions near windows. Rainy season prompted strict moisture checks that slowed entry to a crawl. Attendants would unwrap each visitor's cloak folds, searching for damp scrolls. The emperors played their own games. Augustus-sponsored libraries then used attendance records to identify dissident scholars. Nero ordered public reading contests that forced intellectuals to humiliate themselves for access renewals. Hadrian took the opposite tack, expanding hours but requiring patrons to recite passages perfectly before entering, effectively creating knowledge-based segregation. Christianity's rise complicated matters further. Early church fathers denounced pagan libraries while secretly relying on them for classical education. Some scholars claim Christian scribes deliberately misfiled pagan philosophical works to lose them. The ultimate irony? Many preserved Christian texts today survived because pagan librarians kept backup copies in defiance of emperors who wanted them destroyed. These exclusionary practices shaped Western intellectual traditions. Modern universities still restrict rare book access. Research libraries maintain membership fees echoing Roman patronage systems. Even the language persists. Private study literally meant away from the plebs in Latin. Observing silence was easier when most voices were barred from speaking at all. Those privileged enough to access the vaults developed peculiar daily rituals. Some wore special fingerless gloves to handle scrolls without smudging. Others chewed resin gum to prevent coughs during long sessions. A few eccentric patrons hired personal scroll turners. Enslaved assistants trained to unroll texts at precise speeds. Wealthy scholars brought their own reading stands and adjustable lamps rather than use the library's worn equipment. Morning arrivals often found attendants still dusting alcoves. Dedicated scholars would wait in designated standing areas, breath visible in winter as they reviewed notes from wax tablets. Library slaves circulated with raisin and nut mixtures meant to stave off hunger without messy crumbs. The truly obsessed ignored these rations, earning scowls from librarians when their stomach growls disrupted the quiet. Legal scholars clustered near special collections, requiring additional permissions. Their murmurs about precedent and loopholes occasionally drew ire, though most complaints came from philosophical rivals rather than librarians. Medical students got relegated to secondary halls, where their anatomical sketches wouldn't disturb sensitive patrons. Poetics groups faced constant scrutiny, lest their dramatic whisper readings of verse cross into performative territory. Midday brought the closest thing to socialization allowed. Patrons could step into enclosed courtyards for 15-minute breaks, where quiet conversation was tolerated over watered wine. These spaces became de facto networking hubs, though speaking too loudly meant losing afternoon access privileges. Clever scholars developed lip-reading skills to communicate without breaking rules. The afternoons saw renewed intensity as light faded. Attendants lit oil lamps for approved patrons, often adjusting wicks differently based on status. Brighter for senators studying treaties, dimmer for poets ostensibly seeking atmosphere. Slave scribes worked in growing shadows to meet copying quotas, their hands cramping as they strained to see faint ink. Closing time arrived abruptly. A single bronze bell rang, triggering immediate scroll returns regardless of whether you'd finished reading. Lingering brought demerits recorded in the librarian's ledger. Accumulate 3 and you lost access for a month. Wealthy patrons circumvented this by paying slaves to stand guard over their materials overnight, reserving spots for dawn. These routines demanded physical endurance. Scholars developed back problems from hunching over scrolls. Eye strain was epidemic. Galen prescribed compresses of chamomile and moonlight for those who'd stared at texts too long. Hands cramped from holding styluses for hours required massages with olive oil and beeswax. Yet participants considered these pains marks of dedication rather than flaws in the system. The rituals spread beyond Rome itself. Provincial libraries aped the capital's exclusionary habits without the same resources. A town in Gaul might boast marble columns, but only stock agricultural manuals no one wanted to read. Greek libraries under Roman rule enforced Latin proficiency tests that native speakers often failed. Even military outposts maintained libraries consisting of just 20 approved scrolls under armed guard. Night owls had few options. Some physicians secured after-hours access by claiming emergency research needs, and conveniently discovering cures at sunrise. Underground, the Roman Scholars' Day began before sunrise. You'd wake to a slave lighting your oil lamp, already dressed in your reading tunic, a special loose garment that didn't crease when you bent over scrolls for hours. First stop, the latrine. Emptying your bladder was non-negotiable. Library attendants turned away anyone who asked for bathroom breaks before noon. Then came the supplies check. Wax tablets, bone stylus, sponge eraser, ink horn with oak gall solution, and emergency parchment snippets for notes. Forget any item, and you'd waste precious morning hours sending a slave home to retrieve it. The walk to the library was strategic. Wealthy scholars took litters to avoid sweating before handling delicate scrolls. Others chose routes avoiding bakeries and fish markets. The smells clung to clothing and annoyed librarians. Arriving at dawn meant joining a queue of similarly obsessed readers, all standing silent as statues while guards checked credentials. Any grogginess vanished when those bronze doors creaked open. The sudden temperature drop from entering the climate-controlled space acted like a neurological reset. First 2 hours were for serious work, usually reviewing texts copied the previous day. You'd warm up your hand by recopying key passages onto wax tablets, the stylus making soft popping sounds as it released from the softened beeswax. Experienced scholars could write without looking, keeping eyes trained on the original scroll. The best developed shorthand systems allowing them to compress speeches into cryptic symbols only they could decipher. One lawyer's notes from 79 AD survive with markings that still haven't been decoded. Mid-morning brought the first physical challenge: scroll handling fatigue. Holding a 15-foot papyrus roll open required constant tension in the left arm, while the right hand took notes. Scholars developed chronic shoulder imbalances, librarians mocked as philosopher's hunch. Some wealthy patrons brought enslaved page-turners, but purists considered this cheating. Veterans knew tricks like weighting scroll ends with lead strips or using knee braces to prop open sections. The truly desperate rubbed their arms with vinegar-soaked cloths to numb the burning muscles. Mental fatigue hit around the 4th hour. Eyes strained from deciphering cramped handwriting in low light. Stomachs growled despite the pre-dawn barley porridge. This was when librarians circulated with their silencing rods, cracking them against marble columns at the first sign of yawning. Smart scholars timed their breaks before getting caught, stepping into the cloister for prescribed eye exercises, staring at distant columns, then close-up mosaics in repeating cycles. Others nibbled honey candies from secret pockets, though crumbs risked permanent expulsion. Noon meals were strategic. Some libraries allowed cold fare like hard-boiled eggs or figs that wouldn't stain scrolls. Others enforced strict no-food policies, prompting scholars to gorge beforehand or suffer until dusk. Water was permitted only in lead-weighted cups that couldn't tip easily. Documentary evidence shows staff added trace amounts of vinegar to discourage overdrinking. The sour taste prevented bathroom emergencies without quenching thirst completely. Afternoons were for collaborative work under heavy restrictions. 2 scholars could share a scroll if they used silent gestures refined over years. A raised pinky might mean disagree with this premise, while stroking one's beard signaled need clarification. Outsiders mistook these interactions for odd tics until librarians explained the code. Some study groups developed entire signing systems, like the Stoic Circle in Nero's reign, that could conduct philosophical debates through eyebrow movements alone. Physical discomfort peaked around the 8th hour. Even padded chairs couldn't prevent what Romans called scribal sciatica, a radiating pain from hips to calves caused by immobility. Standing desks existed, but required special permission. Veterans wrapped their legs in wool bands for circulation, while others discreetly stretched under desks when librarians weren't looking. The worst was library headache, caused by eye strain and incense smoke. Some manuscripts mention scholars rubbing their temples with mint-infused wax for relief. Social dynamics played out in bizarre ways within silence constraints. Senior scholars claimed prime seating through elaborate rituals, leaving personal inkwells overnight to reserve spots, or bribing attendants to remove competitors' cloaks. Younger academics practiced scroll hovering, standing conspicuously near esteemed thinkers hoping for mentoring glances. Gossip spread through exaggerated note-taking, scribbling seemingly innocent quotes, then angling tablets for others to read between the lines. Closing time sparked silent scrambles. Librarians permitted no overtime, so scholars raced to finish passages before attendants arrived with candle snuffers. Some tried bribery for extra minutes. Stricter libraries imposed fines doubling every quarter hour. The desperate developed tricks like feigning seizures to prolong access. Rome's medical texts oddly include many library seizure remedies. The walk home was its own ordeal. Eyes struggled to adjust from lamplight to dusk streets. Hands cramped around the day's notes instinctively, even when empty. Wealthy scholars hired guides to steer them while they mentally reviewed texts. Several epitaphs mention philosophers killed walking into traffic while preoccupied. Evenings were for transcription and memorization. Slaves prepared special lighting with extra oil to prevent eye fatigue. Scholars transferred wax tablet notes to parchment scrolls using memory techniques, visualizing texts as rooms where each idea occupied furniture. Some recited aloud in soundproofed home study cubicles, though neighbors often complained about the droning. Night brought bizarre coping mechanisms. Many soaked their hands in warm vinegar to loosen stiff joints, a practice physicians warned against, but scholars swore by. Eye compresses of chamomile and moonlight, literally left outdoors at night, allegedly prevented next-day redness. The truly dedicated slept with wax tablets under pillows, believing ideas migrated into dreams. This marathon wasn't sustainable. Ancient medical texts describe library illnesses, chronic back humps, finger deformities, even rectal prolapse from hours of pressure on seating bones. But the scholars persisted, driven by competition and the terror of being outread by rivals. Their endurance puts modern attention spans to shame. No app notifications, no quick snack breaks, just unbroken focus stretching sunrise to sunset. Rome's libraries weaponized this discipline into educational systems. Without lectures or classrooms, they created environments where knowledge passed directly from scroll to mind through sheer exposure. Modern educators might cringe at the physical toll, but they can't argue with the results. Centuries of scholarship emerged from these silent chambers where concentration wasn't taught, but engineered. The library's true curriculum was endurance. By removing all comforts and distractions, they forced minds to develop stamina we've since abandoned. Today's students juggle devices and notifications while Romans had one advantage we lack: spaces where focus wasn't a choice, but the only option. Late-night studying blurred into obsession for some. Accounts exist of scholars sneaking back after dark, scaling library walls to read by stolen candlelight. Others bribed night guards to accidentally leave doors unlocked. The most extreme case comes from Alexandria, where a grammarian allegedly lived secretly in the rafters for 3 months, lowering baskets to retrieve scrolls after closing. These behaviors seem pathological until you consider what was at stake. In a world without printing presses or search engines, knowledge lived exclusively in those guarded halls. Missing a single day meant falling behind rivals competing for the same patronage positions. The bodily suffering mattered less than the terror of intellectual oblivion. Yet the system worked. Roman education produced lawyers who could recite entire legal codes from memory, doctors versed in hundreds of herbal remedies, and philosophers who reconstructed arguments from fragments alone. Their secret wasn't superior intelligence, but environmental conditioning we'd find unbearable today. Against instinct, the discomfort may have aided recall. Modern studies show physical hardship enhances memory formation. The Roman scholar's stiff neck and aching hands, possibly cementing Virgil's verses deeper than any comfortable reading nook could. The regimen reshaped bodies over time. Examinations of scholars' remains reveal distinct skeletal adaptations. Enlarged right forearm bones from constant writing, compressed lower vertebrae from sitting, even worn tooth grooves where styluses habitually rested during thought. These people became physiologically optimized for library life. Psychological effects were equally profound. Scrolls mention scholars dreaming in written text rather than spoken words, their subconscious absorbing the medium. Some developed aversions to loud noises that persisted outside libraries, jumping at normal street sounds. Others reported losing conversational speech fluency after long study periods, their minds stuck in reading rhythm. The libraries knew what they were doing. Every architectural choice, from hard seating to controlled lighting, wasn't just about preservation, but molding minds capable of withstanding the text's demands. You didn't just read philosophy in Rome. You physically became a vessel for it through punishing exposure. Watching sunrise through library arches after an all-night study session became a rite of passage. The way morning light hit certain scroll cases signaled which texts to prioritize that day. Veteran scholars could time sessions by the solar angles crossing reading tables. This intimate familiarity with space and light created a sensory relationship to learning impossible in today's interchangeable study halls. Even breaks followed celestial logic. Stepping outside when shadows reached certain columns became the ancient equivalent of Pomodoro timers. Modern attempts to replicate this focus fail because we've divorced knowledge absorption from physical discipline. Roman scholars didn't conquer texts through apps or hacks, but by submitting to environments engineered to strip away every distraction, including comforts we consider basic rights. Their secret wasn't willpower, but architecture that made distraction physically painful. As libraries evolved into educational centers, they retained this core philosophy. True learning requires environmental control. The books mattered, but the real magic was in designing spaces that shattered attention's natural limits. Where we see torture, Romans saw the only path to mastery, an idea either horrifying or inspirational, depending on how badly you want to learn something. The transition from solitary study to organized education wasn't smooth. Early library schools struggled with noise complaints, as teachers tried lecturing in spaces designed for silence. Some experimented with hand signal instruction before realizing whispers carried well in acoustically perfected halls. Eventually, they'd strike a compromise that shaped Western education forever. Roman libraries didn't just store knowledge. They functioned as full-service intellectual factories. Without classrooms or formal curricula, they developed alternative education systems that put modern universities to shame. The key was enforced proximity. Throw obsessive scholars into silent rooms with limited texts, and learning happens through osmotic pressure. Private tutors operated in library niches, their whispers barely audible over the scratching of styluses. A typical lesson involved the tutor mouthing phrases while students lip-read and copied them onto wax tablets. Advanced classes used relay systems. The tutor would murmur to the first student, who passed it down the line through gestures and facial expressions. Silent debates flourished through coded note passing that librarians tolerated if done discreetly. Some philosophical schools developed entire argument structures using finger counting, where each raised digit represented a premise or objection. Text selection followed strict hierarchies. Beginners started with grammar scrolls wrapped in blue leather, color-coded for difficulty. Mathematics students received problem sets on reusable wax tablets, while theory stayed on precious papyrus. Legal training involved comparing multiple scrolls side by side to spot contradictions, a privilege reserved for advanced scholars. Medical practitioners studied from illustrated texts in special viewing rooms where they could examine anatomical diagrams without exposing fragile pages to oil lamp fumes. Public speeches fed directly into library study. Orators performed in nearby forums each morning, then moved to the library where their speeches were transcribed by enslaved scribes. Students analyzed these texts within hours of delivery, marking rhetorical techniques with colored wax dots. Competitive scholars memorized entire speeches to recite back, not to the orator, but to librarians who authenticated their recall. Some tutors held silent declamation contests where students pantomimed famous speeches while peers guessed the reference. Note-taking became an art form. Scholars developed personal shorthand systems with symbols replacing common Latin phrases. One surviving wax tablet shows 50 lines of legal argument compressed into 6 barely legible marks. Memory techniques relied on physical mnemonics, associating passages with specific library corners or shelf positions. The most advanced students could walk through mental reconstructions of scrolls, retrieving quotes by imagining their placement in physical space. Competition for texts turned ruthless. Popular scrolls had waiting lists scratched onto bronze plaques. Rivals sabotaged each other by misplacing requested materials or smudging ink on critical passages. Some scholars bribed copyists to introduce subtle errors into competitors' texts. A few extreme cases involved stealing entire scrolls and hiding them inside clothing. One preserved letter complains about a philosopher caught smuggling Aristotle's Politics under his tunic, with only the title Rod visible at his collar. Medicine was studied differently from other disciplines. Instead of loaning texts, Libraries confined medical scrolls to observation rooms where students memorized passages under supervision. Treatment protocols were copied onto lead sheets that could be sterilized between users. Surgeons practiced on diagrams drawn in wet clay that slaves smoothed out after each session. The best students earned the right to take notes, but only after proving they could recite entire chapters flawlessly. Poetry training happened in near darkness. Libraries reserved dimly lit alcoves where students listened to masters whisper verses, then attempted repetitions from memory. Rhythm was taught by tapping fingernails against marble benches in complex patterns. One irritating but effective drill involved tutors suddenly covering scrolls mid-line, forcing students to complete verses through logical progression rather than rote copying. Legal education resembled combat training. Apprentices spent mornings in court observing advocates, then recreated arguments in library moot courts using abridged scroll versions of cases. Senior jurists left deliberately flawed analyses in margins for students to identify. A wrong correction meant copying the entire scroll as punishment. The Library of Carthage famously staged silent debates where participants could only cite texts they'd physically retrieve within a time limit. Philosophy thrived through scarcity. Libraries kept opposing schools' texts far apart to force scholars to physically traverse the building between readings. This intentional inconvenience spawned hybrid thinkers who synthesized ideas during the walk between sections. Some tutors posted contradictory quotes from different philosophers and challenged students to reconcile them without speaking. A single heavily annotated copy of Plato might represent years' worth of these silent dialogues in its margins. Military strategy was studied through board games. Since battle diagrams wore out quickly, major libraries kept sand tables where students recreated historical campaigns using colored pebbles. Scrolls describing famous battles were deliberately incomplete. Scholars had to request supplemental materials from separate archives to fill gaps. Veterans taught by moving troops, represented by carved wooden pieces, according to students' written orders, then revealing actual outcomes from sealed answer scrolls. Mathematics instruction bypassed scroll limitations entirely. Problems were posed on wax tablets, solved on abacus or counting boards, then erased. Only final theorems earned parchment transcription. The Library of Alexandria maintained a wall of proofs, where breakthrough solutions were painted directly onto plaster in temporary pigments. Exceptional students got to add their discoveries before workers whitewashed the surface monthly. Language learning happened through brutal immersion. Greek students were given Latin texts with no translations and left to decipher them using only grammar scrolls. Errors meant starting over. One account describes a scholar recopying the same Homeric passage 47 times before a librarian approved his comprehension. Advanced students competed to produce the most literal translations, with prizes of rare dictionary scrolls loaned for one night only. Architecture and engineering blended study with practical tests. Scrolls describing famous buildings came with woodblock puzzles students had to assemble correctly. Those mastering theoretical concepts advanced to on-site training where they diagnosed real structures' flaws, but only after accurately drawing them from scroll descriptions alone. The Pantheon's dome was studied this way for centuries before anyone measured it properly. Religious instruction followed peculiar rules. Jewish and early Christian scholars were often restricted to question boxes. They submitted written queries about Scripture and received approved answers days later. Pagan theology students memorized hymns in soundproof chambers to prevent oral transmission of secret rituals. One cult required initiates to copy entire scrolls blindfolded to prove devotion before accessing deeper mysteries. The library's true innovation was making scarcity educational. Limited copies forced students to absorb material thoroughly during brief access periods. No highlighters, no photographs, just desperate memorization under time pressure. Modern students with infinite digital access might retain less than Roman counterparts who got 1 precious hour with a text every fortnight. Private study coexisted with institutional learning. Wealthy families rented library annexes for personal tutoring, paying extra for enslaved scholars to pre-select and summarize texts. These study suites became early versions of college dormitories, with students sleeping on pallets between shelves. Some developed loyalty to particular library wings, like modern academics, favoring certain university departments. Peer review happened through marginalia. Scholars left notes in scroll margins responding to previous readers' comments, a silent conversation across generations. One legal text from Pompeii preserves 5 centuries of heated juristic arguments in its cramped edges. Librarians periodically transcribed these debates onto fresh scrolls, creating metatexts documenting intellectual evolution. Exam systems emerged organically. To check progress, tutors staged silent recitations, where students performed entire texts through gesture and facial expression. Passing meant advancing to rarer scrolls. Failure sent you back to basic grammar drills. The ultimate test, defending original theses against written critiques without verbal rebuttal, could take years to prepare for. These systems worked startlingly well. Roman-educated doctors successfully treated conditions still puzzling modern medicine. Their engineers built structures standing for millennia. Legal arguments crafted in libraries shaped Western jurisprudence, all without lectures, seminars, or PowerPoints, just silent rooms where minds wrestled with preserved thoughts. Slowly, the model frayed. Political instability meant fewer wealthy patrons funding libraries. Incompetent librarians allowed collections to decay. Most critically, the rise of parchment codices made knowledge too portable for controlled. Library environments. Like any system depending on scarcity, it collapsed when information became easier to reproduce. The shift to codices changed learning itself. Students no longer needed to memorize whole works when they could own personal copies. Debate returned to public forums as texts circulated freely. Libraries remained, but their role as education centers diminished alongside their monopoly on knowledge. What's striking isn't how different Roman education was, but how similar. Our universities still privilege those who can navigate physical spaces and bureaucratic systems. Rare books remain restricted. Peer review continues as marginal comments in digital formats. We've just replaced silent lip reading with muted Zoom chats and scroll smuggling with PDF piracy. The real casualties were the teaching methods born from constraints. Nobody today learns medicine through supervised memorization or law through timed scroll retrieval. Whether we've lost or gained by abandoning those harsh disciplines depends on how much you trust modern education's comforts. One thing's certain: Roman libraries trained minds to endure. No modern student submits to 12-hour silent study sessions on stone benches. Maybe we've optimized comfort at the expense of resilience, or maybe those scholars would have killed for a highlight. The quiet didn't last. Roman libraries began crumbling long before the empire itself. Their decline starting with something as mundane as budget cuts. When the crisis of the 3rd century hit, emperors diverted library funds to armies. Maintaining silence became a luxury Rome couldn't afford. Attendants got laid off, scroll repairs stopped, and scholars found doors locked during usual hours. The first sign of trouble was when libraries started selling off duplicate texts, then rare ones, to pay for basic upkeep. Soon, the Palatine Library was renting out reading rooms as storage space for olive oil merchants. Invasions finished what austerity started. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, they didn't specifically target libraries. They just burned entire districts without discrimination. Librarians desperately squirreled away precious scrolls in sewer tunnels and tombs, but most survived only as fragments used to wrap fish or patch roofs. The real loss wasn't fire itself, but the knowledge of where things belonged. Even intact collections became useless when the enslaved librarians who'd memorized their organization died or fled. Christianity accelerated the decline. though not how you might think. Early Christians didn't mass burn pagan texts. They just stopped maintaining them. Imperial funds shifted to church scriptoriums copying Bibles. Without official patronage, library roofs caved in from unrepaired leaks. Scrolls mildewed in the damp. One account describes scholars at the Ulpian Library reading under umbrellas during rainstorms because the ceiling had more holes than a fisherman's net. The switch from scrolls to codices, early books, changed reading habits. Codices were cheaper and more portable, making libraries less essential. Why wait weeks to access a scroll when you could own a codex copy? As private collections grew, public libraries became relics. The last librarians were essentially glorified guards protecting empty prestige buildings. By 450 AD, most libraries were just facades with a few outdated scrolls displayed for nostalgia. Warrior cultures had no use for silent reading rooms. When Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor in 476, his Ostrogoths turned libraries into armories. Shelves held spears instead of scrolls. Scholars who complained got recruited as military scribes tracking grain supplies. The Senate still funded a skeleton staff at the Library of Caelius until 530, mainly to maintain appearances. But the last librarian reportedly couldn't even read Greek. Natural disasters administered the final blows. The 79 Vesuvius eruption preserved Pompeii's scrolls under ash, but destroyed active libraries across Campania. Earthquakes toppled library columns in Antioch and Constantinople. Even when buildings stood, moisture and insects devoured neglected collections. A Byzantine historian wrote that the library of Pergamum's texts became so worm-eaten they resembled lace more than literature. Changing educational priorities sealed the fate. Roman elites stopped valuing encyclopedic knowledge, preferring practical skills like estate management. Children learned accounting instead of Aristotle. The few remaining libraries became vanity projects. Hadrian's villa kept a library with fake scrolls made of painted wood to impress guests. Real scholarship moved to monasteries, where monks preserved texts but abandoned the Roman ideal of organized, accessible knowledge. The Eastern Empire tried holding on longer. Constantinople's imperial library limped into the 8th century, but fires in 473 and 726 destroyed most holdings. What survived got parceled out to churches. By the time Crusaders sacked the city in 1204, no one remembered where the main library had stood. Travelers reported seeing stray parchment fragments floating in the harbor. Their ink washed into illegibility. Barbarian kingdoms occasionally tried reviving libraries with dismal results. Theodoric the Great ordered Ostrogothic nobles to maintain Roman learning, but his librarians were former soldiers who shelved scrolls by color rather than content. Charlemagne's palace school recycled Roman library architecture without understanding acoustics. His scholars complained the echo made quiet study impossible. Ironically, Islamic caliphates preserved Roman library concepts better than Christendom. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad mimicked Alexandria's organizational systems, even employing exiled Byzantine scholars. But they favored open debate over Roman silence, turning reading rooms into lively discussion halls. The medieval European monasteries that saved classical texts rejected Roman library culture entirely. Their scriptoriums prized copying over study, production over preservation. The physical spaces got repurposed in cynical ways. In Rome, the Library of Augustus became a straw storage depot. Carthage's great library was dismantled stone by stone to build a bishop's palace. At least 3 Mediterranean churches used library shelves as pews, sitting parishioners where scholars once stood. Parchment salvage became a thriving industry. Workers boiled discarded scrolls to reuse the material, creating palimpsests, where faint traces of Cicero lurked beneath psalms. One analysis found a 10th century Bible overwritten on military logistics manuals. Someone had turned battle plans into liturgy. The silent study ethic vanished entirely. Medieval scholars thought nothing of reading aloud even in private, considering silent reading suspicious. The idea that mental focus required environmental control would have baffled them. When Renaissance humanists rediscovered Roman library designs, they marveled at acoustic tricks their own architects hadn't replicated in 1,000 years. Economic realities doomed any revival attempts. Maintaining climate-controlled spaces with armies of trained librarians cost more than medieval societies could spend. It's estimated the Library of Alexandria, at its height, consumed 5% of the Ptolemaic kingdom's budget. No European monarch would have considered that a wise investment. Ironically, the transition from scrolls to codices, one factor in libraries' decline, saved much of their content. Codices were cheaper to copy and lasted longer in poor conditions. What we know of Roman libraries largely comes from codex copies made during their final years. Without those, even the memory of these institutions might have vanished. Personal libraries fared slightly better. Wealthy Romans shuttered their great houses, but sometimes walled up collections first. In 1754, diggers found a near-intact private library in Herculaneum, carbonized by volcanic gas but still legible in places. The owner had apparently locked the doors during the eruption, preserving texts even as he died. By the 7th century, the very concept of public libraries felt outdated. When Bishop Isidore of Seville compiled his encyclopedia around 625, he described Roman libraries as if explaining some alien civilization. His readers couldn't fathom why anyone would need that many texts in one place. The silence, the organization, the enforced focus, all seemed excessive to societies where literacy itself was becoming rare. The Eastern Romans made one last attempt. In the 9th century, Emperor Basil I rebuilt Constantinople's imperial library, staffing it with scholars recovered from Baghdad. But they focused on religious texts, abandoning the Roman model of universal knowledge. When the Ottomans took the city in 1453, they found the library already stripped of anything not related to theology. Some rituals lingered unconsciously. Medieval monks still washed hands before handling books, though they'd forgotten this originated with Roman library rules. University lecture halls inherited the basilica shapes of great libraries, but none replicated their soundproofing. Even today, the quiet study area in modern libraries faintly echoes Roman ideals, though we've replaced slave librarians with politely worded signs. The final insult came from scholarship itself. Renaissance humanists obsessed over rediscovered classical texts, but showed no interest in how they'd originally been housed. They wanted the content, not the context. When Vatican archivists opened sealed ancient scrolls in the 1500s, they often destroyed them in the process. Precious texts crumbling after surviving a millennium in better custody. What really died with Roman libraries wasn't just books, but an entire philosophy of learning. They believed environment shaped thought in ways we've only recently rediscovered. Modern studies confirm what Roman librarians knew. Distraction isn't a personal failing, but an architectural one. Standing in the ruins of the Baths of Caracalla's library today, you can still feel the difference. The way sound dies against thick walls, how light falls evenly across broken reading alcoves. The stones remember what we forgot. That focus isn't natural, it's built. Their legacy hides in plain sight. Next time you visit a rare books room with its controlled humidity and strict silence rules, you're experiencing the last whisper of a system perfected 2,000 years ago. Even the hush between library stacks owes something to enslaved attendants who once patrolled with rods at the ready. The difference is, their silence worked. Modern libraries struggle with the same problems: noise complaints, budget cuts, shifting formats, but lack the authoritarian tools to solve them. Maybe we've improved on Rome's model by making knowledge more accessible, or maybe we've lost something essential by abandoning their ruthless commitment to preserving focus at all costs. There's a reason people still romanticize the Library of Alexandria while ignoring the Amazon warehouse holding millions more books. The containers shape what they contain. The lesson survives in surprising places. Silent meditation retreats essentially recreate Roman library conditions, restricted movement, controlled environments, enforced focus. Some tech-free schools have accidentally revived the scroll and tablet method of teaching handwriting before allowing computer use. Even noise-canceling headphones mimic what thick library walls once provided. The tragedy isn't that Roman libraries fell, but that we remember only their contents, not their containers. We preserved Virgil, but lost the silent halls that taught generations how to truly read him. The texts survived, the focused minds to appreciate them, less so. Now their ruins remind us uncomfortably that knowledge requires more than information. It needs environments that respect how human attention actually works. 2,000 years later, with our endless notifications and open-plan offices, we're still struggling to relearn what those quiet rooms understood instinctively. Sometimes walls make better teachers than words. Their legacy isn't just in what they saved, but in how they saved it. The radical idea that thinking deeply requires designing spaces where shallow thought becomes physically impossible. Every time you get shushed in a library, you're experiencing a Roman innovation. Those silent reading rooms didn't invent themselves. They're the direct descendants of a system perfected 2,000 years ago. The Vatican Library's reading room copies Roman acoustics so precisely that whispers die mid-air near the shelves. Harvard's Widener Library uses humidity controls first developed for scroll preservation. Even the humble no-food rule started when Roman librarians got tired of scholars dripping olive oil on expensive papyrus. Medieval monasteries preserved Roman ideas by accident. Copyists working in cloisters unconsciously replicated library layouts. Aisles wide enough for one person, desks angled to prevent eye contact. The St. Gall monastery plan from 820 AD shows a scriptorium with identical dimensions to Rome's Ulpian library. Monks didn't call it Roman design, they just knew this setup minimized distractions better than their drafty chapels. The rule of St. Benedict even included provisions like no coughing during copying that would have made a Roman librarian nod approvingly. Renaissance architects went digging for Roman library secrets. When Filippo Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon's dome, he also took notes on how ancient reading rooms channeled light. The Medici Library in Florence lifted its long, narrow reading hall design directly from ruins near the Roman Forum. There was just one problem. Renaissance scholars loved debating aloud, so they had to add sound-absorbing tapestries to compensate for their noisier habits. Modern silent study areas are Roman principles in cheap carpeting. That weird hush in university libraries? It's not natural. It's engineered through acoustic panels placed exactly where Roman builders would have put cedar baffles. Even the furniture follows ancient ergonomics. Adjustable reading stands evolved into those sloping library desks people still hunch over today. The New York Public Library's Rose Main reading room could seat 1,000 scholars, almost exactly the capacity of the Library of Pergamum's Great Hall. We've lost more than you'd think. Roman libraries used slave labor for a reason. Their conservation methods required obsessive maintenance nobody's willing to pay for now. Scrolls got monthly inspections for mold and insects. Floors were swept with ostrich feathers to avoid raising dust. Today, rare book rooms try similar protocols, but budget cuts mean most libraries just crank the AC and hope for the best. The biggest loss was environmental control. Roman libraries weren't just quiet. They smelled like cedar oil and had precisely regulated temperatures ideal for both humans and parchment. Modern buildings prioritize energy efficiency over focus optimization. That's why you freeze in some library corners and bake in others. Our HVAC engineers worry about kilowatt hours, not fostering concentration. Some Roman ideas were too extreme to last. The penalty for breaking silence, public humiliation, and permanent banning would spark lawsuits today. Their solution to noisy patrons wasn't polite signs, but armed attendants with rods. And let's be honest, nobody misses the strip searches upon exit to prevent scroll theft. Digital distractions shattered what little silence remained. Where Roman scholars only competed with their own boredom, you're fighting Twitter notifications and laptop pings. Ancient reading rooms eliminated temptations architecturally. We expect willpower to do the same job amid constant alerts. It's like trying to meditate in a circus. Yet the core insight persists. Focus flourishes within constraints. Roman libraries proved that deep work requires designed environments, not just good intentions. Modern attempts like focus pods and phone-free zones are clumsy imitations of their system. Audiologists confirm what Roman architects knew. Consistent background noise above 30 decibels halves comprehension. That's why today's open-plan offices are productivity killers dressed in chic furniture. Private companies are quietly reviving Roman techniques. Apple's library-inspired campuses include sound-dampening materials adapted from ancient theaters. Silicon Valley execs install focus chambers with lighting that mimics Rome's north-facing reading rooms. Even the digital detox trend accidentally mirrors Roman scroll handling rituals, setting strict time limits and physical barriers between users and distractions. Education systems struggle with the same trade-offs. Roman libraries prioritized quality access for few over universal mediocrity. Modern universities flip this, creating crowded lecture halls where no concentrated study happens. Some Oxford colleges still enforce Roman-like silence in reading periods. Students report retaining more from these sessions than entire semesters of normal classes. The Vatican preserves the last authentic experience. Its 16th century library maintains Roman traditions like pre-approved research requests and monitored reading sessions. Scholars still get assigned specific desks for consistency. The main difference? Instead of enslaved custodians, Swiss guards now patrol the halls. Ironically, modern science confirms Roman instincts. Studies show memory retention improves in scent-controlled environments, something scroll rubbers knew empirically. Eye-tracking research proves north light really does reduce fatigue. Even the Roman habit of studying while standing gets vindicated by ergonomic studies about posture and focus. We've improved some aspects. Wheelchair ramps beat step-heavy Roman designs. Female scholars no longer need male escorts. And thank whatever gods you prefer for fluorescent lighting instead of eye-straining oil lamps. But these are tweaks to a system we didn't invent, just inherited. The persistence of certain details is eerie. That little ledge below library shelves for resting books, Roman scribes used identical ones to support scroll rods. The return cart where you drop off finished books, a direct descendant of the labeled cubicles where attendants sorted scrolls for reshuffling. Even the way librarians stamp due dates echoes ancient systems for tracking scroll circulation. Roman flaws also haunt us. Their elitism evolved into today's academic gatekeeping. The same social classes that struggled for library access now battle paywalls and tuition costs. Knowledge remains a commodity, just with differently designed barriers. Perhaps the most lasting legacy is psychological. Roman libraries taught Western civilization that some thoughts only emerge in sustained silence. When monasteries preserved this ideal, they ensured exiled scholars had mental tools to rebuild culture. Every time you crave a quiet place to think, you're channeling a cognitive habit forged in those marble halls. The battle continues in surprising fronts. Public libraries now carve out silent zones after realizing study areas became social clubs. Universities invest in focus furniture that mimics Roman ergonomics. Even app designers ape ancient principles. Reader modes that hide distractions are just digital versions of library sound buffers. Physical books retain one Roman advantage: no ebook matches. They can't ping notifications. Studies show print readers retain more than digital ones, likely because books don't multitask. In this sense, the Codex, which killed scrolls, became Rome's ultimate revenge, a format preserving the contemplative pace libraries cultivated. We'll never fully return to silent study halls, Too much of modern life rewards fractured attention, but pockets of resistance endure. Next time you see students crammed into library corners despite acres of empty seating elsewhere, recognize the pattern. They're instinctively recreating Roman conditions where focus thrives. The irony: today's distractions make Roman methods more relevant than ever. Their solution wasn't apps or hacks, but architectural truths about human cognition. 2 millennia later, we're still chasing the perfect quiet they once engineered from stone and discipline. Maybe the answer wasn't in the scrolls after all, but the silent spaces between them. What remains is an unsettling question. If reading comprehension scores keep declining as libraries get noisier, is that coincidence or proof the Romans knew something we've forgotten? Their ruined libraries stand as mute witnesses to a radical idea we've never improved upon: that thinking requires designed emptiness. Coffee shops try selling focus with artisanal beans. Tech giants promise concentration through apps. Meanwhile, the real secret sits crumbling in Roman ruins, spaces built not for comfort, but for thoughts worth preserving. Before digital distractions, before existential ennui, there were quiet rooms where minds could hear themselves. We broke those rooms. Now we wonder why we can't think straight. 2,000 years later, we're still chasing what the Romans mastered: silence worth thinking in. Their libraries proved focus isn't about willpower. It's about walls that absorb distractions instead of bouncing them back. Maybe we've complicated things with apps and tips when the solution was always simpler. Build a room where your mind has nowhere to wander. Try it tonight. Turn off the pings. Sit where the light won't flicker. Pretend there's an enslaved librarian glaring at your phone. The Romans built temples to concentration. We can at least clear a corner. Sleep comes easier in quiet places designed for it.